Okay, so I'm starting. Just watching participants pop in. Welcome everyone. We're gonna get going in just a minute. Thank you for coming. Welcome everyone. We'll get going in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. We might have some people coming in a minute or two late, but we'll get the introductions out of the way so we can get going with our exciting speaker for today. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone who's here virtually. I'm Alice Rakowski. I'm an associate professor of English, and I'm the president this year of Geneseo's Phi Beta Kappa chapter. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. This is designed as an expression of sorrow and remembrance to those whose historic territory we reside on. In particular, Geneseo resides on the homeland of the Seneca Nation of Indians and the Tonawanda Seneca Nation. Acknowledging not all of us are in Geneseo currently. If you haven't already, I encourage you to learn more about the original occupants on the land on which you reside using the Native Land app. This app also redirects you to some helpful websites such as sni.org, where you can learn about the community of more than 7,000 enrolled Indigenous peoples. In case you didn't already know, Phi Beta Kappa is the country's oldest honor society, founded in 1776. Since then, it has celebrated excellence in the liberal arts and sciences and championed freedom of thought. It honors the best and brightest liberal arts and sciences undergraduates from 290 top schools across the nation through a highly selective merit-based invitation process. A fierce advocate for the value and benefits of liberal arts and sciences education, Phi Beta Kappa has existed at Geneseo since 2004. A few logistical things before we get going. Our speaker, about whom you will hear from in just a moment, has prepared a very interactive talk. He plans to pose questions in between slides. And we encourage audience members to make use of the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard. If you haven't been to a Zoom webinar before, it's a little bit different than a regular Zoom meeting. So if you look at your toolbar down on the bottom, next to participants, you'll see a Q&A symbol, and you can click on that and submit a question at any time that we can see. So that's how we're going to be taking all questions. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Doug Baldwin. He is a professor of mathematics who will give us some background on today's speaker. Professor Baldwin is the past president of PBK here at Geneseo. Professor Baldwin.
Thank you, Alice, and welcome to everybody. I'm delighted that Geneseo is able to host Dr. Martin Gruebele as this year's Phi Beta Kappa lecturer. Dr. Gruebele is a professor at the University of Illinois. He holds the James R. Eisner Endowed Chair in Chemistry, as well as professorships in physics and biophysics and quantitative biology, and is a professor in the Center for Advanced Studies. He obtained his Bachelor of Science in 1984 and his PhD in 1988, both at UC Berkeley, did a postdoc at Caltech, and then joined the faculty at the University of Illinois in 1992. His research interests include protein and RNA folding, fast dynamics in live cells, vibrational energy flow in molecules, quantum computing and measurement, nanoscale imaging of excited states, glass dynamics, and locomotion and sensing dynamics. As you can get the sense, he is a very active researcher. The work is published in over 300 papers and reviews. He's a fellow of the American Physical, Chemical, and Biophysical Societies and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as being a member of both the United States National Academy of Sciences and the German National Academy of Sciences. So we are both pleased and honored today to have Martin Gruebele speaking to us on the long-term prospects of science. Dr. Gruebele.
And there we go. I should be unmuted. I hope everybody can hear me. If not, put something in the chat, right, or in the Q&A, and let the host know. Again, thank you very much for having me out. I have really enjoyed these visits. They're a little different from the typical talk where you just talk about your specialty, you know, for 50 minutes. What I'm going to do is I have a talk that has 8 slides in it only. And I might not even get through all 8 of them. The last time I gave it, I got through 3 or 4 of them, something like that. And it's not going to be on my topic of specialty at all. Rather, these are going to be sort of questions of where science is going, both in terms of the kinds of things that we might discover, how we might go about doing it, what changes might be in store for young scientists and how they might have to do science in the future. And I am not, so disclaimer, I am not a historian of science. I am not a philosopher of science. I'm not a sociologist who studies scientists. I'm just a scientist. Okay? So I'm actually out of my depth in a way with this talk. But I think these are things that humanists and scientists in general think about. And you know, we might not always discuss them unless we are at the right kind of, you know, cocktail party or whatever with people. But still, I think these are things that we sort of muse about ourselves often enough. And why not do this musing out aloud for a change and sort of get feedback from people. So basically at the end of each one of these slides, which is kind of each one of them is a topic, I'll just stop and ask people if they're interested in asking a question. And I can move on to the next one, or we can just, you know, go through questions, because, you know, some of the things I might say might be slightly controversial. You might not agree with it, or some of it you might agree with maybe so enthusiastically. You want to go like, yes, I think it. I always thought that too. And some of it you might just be curious about, and maybe I know the answer, and maybe not. But you know, there's probably a chance that somebody in the audience will actually know the answer, because we have, I'm sure, a pretty broad participation. That's the nice thing about Phi Beta Kappa. You get people from the humanities, from the sciences, from the social sciences, from everywhere, you know, who are thinking about stuff. Okay, so let me share my screen and make sure that everybody is able to see the show. Get that going here. And Doug or Alice, can you confirm that it's visible on your screen the way, you know, full screen as it should?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect, good. So let me get started then. My talk is the long-term prospects of science, and no better picture than to look at the Earth from above. And you know, there's definitely lots of evidence of human habitation. These are basically the nightlights of Europe. I pick Europe because, as you could probably tell from my accent, I am from Europe myself. I come from southern Germany, and I grew up in Austria and then lived in Spain for a number of years before my family moved to the United States. But you know, yeah, like northern Italy, you know, it's all bright lights. And that big bright spot here, that's Paris, France, and over there is London. And in Germany, it's a little dimmer, but you still get, you know, Berlin and other fairly bright spots. The Netherlands are like one big bright thing, you know, that whole area up there. Well, you know, it's a small world and it's a lot of people, and there's a lot of interesting things to figure out about the world, you know, not just the Earth, but the world, the universe, you know, the world overall. And science is one way of doing it. And we've been at it for, well, at least in the classical Western way now for a few hundred years. And actually, if you include Greek scientists, although a lot of their work was more based on sort of logical thought experiments, the kinds of things that Einstein also was famous for in the 20th century, rather than doing a lot of experiments, even a lot of the work of the ancient Greeks and other civilizations, you know, the Arabs in the Middle Ages, when Europe was kind of dimmed down a little bit as far as science is concerned, but science was flourishing there. And in China and many other places in the world, you know, take South America, right? The Mayan and astronomy, for instance, was extremely highly developed long before European astronomy. So the first topic I want to talk about has to do with, you know, how we make use of energy. And my little title here is Making the Best Use of the Available Neg Entropy. So first of all, what is, you know, neg entropy? Well, it's going to be useful to talk about what entropy is in the first place, because that's already a somewhat tricky concept, but probably one of the most important concepts in science. So, you know, for those of us who study like physics or chemistry or geology or things like this, you know, we learn in our classes that mass energy is conserved So energy just doesn't disappear, and mass doesn't disappear. And actually, in relativity theory, the two can interconvert between one another, but still, the combination of the two is something that's actually conserved. Entropy, on the other hand, as we've all heard somewhere or other, is something that just keeps increasing. It just goes up and up and up. And what it refers to, very loosely speaking, is the tendency of any system to occupy as many of the configurations that it has available as possible. Or a colloquial way of saying that would be that a system has a tendency to get disordered. So for instance, when I was a student, in my dorm room, there was like a shelf, on the wall, and occasionally all my textbooks would actually be lined up alphabetically on that shelf, and maybe that shows a certain degree of compulsive obsessiveness or whatever. But as a saving grace, though, if you were to visit my room at a random time, probably these books were just kind of lying randomly all over the place, and they weren't organized in any kind of way. And then once in a while, I had to come in and actually, sort through them again. And so the reason why the books lying all over the place is a more likely state is really because there are many more microstates in that room that correspond to books lying all over the place than correspond to them sitting alphabetically on a shelf, right? So it's actually because we're trying we think of alphabetic and on a shelf as something special, that it seems to us that that state is more rare than all the other states. Certainly though, if I were to just look at that room and you saw the books lying all over the place, any one of those configurations is unique also, right? If you go into my room one week, you might find the books in a disorderly way lying around on the floor in some way. And if you looked in another week, you might find them lying around on the floor in a different pattern, but you probably wouldn't notice the difference. To you, it would just look like they're lying around. And so all of these possible states, we just call the disordered book state, and all the books on the shelf, we call the low entropy state. Okay? So there's this unique state that has these interesting properties that we like alphabetization and so forth. And then there's all these other states that we consider randomly disordered. And so this is the inherent reason why entropy tends to increase. And negentropy, or as we also sometimes like to call it, the information content, is something really precious, because as entropy increases, we're losing negentropy, or the negative of the entropy. And so information about systems becomes rarer and rarer. And we would need more and more details to actually be able to reconstruct the state of the system. So let me give you a practical example of this, which is very practical and very important for us on Earth here, which is most life on Earth, with the exception of, well, actually, that's even true indirectly for life forms that live deep in the oceans or deep underground. But life on Earth generally subsists on the negentropy of solar photons. Okay? So what I mean by that is that when the sun emits light, it's got a spectrum, it looks kind of like a yellowish star. And roughly at a temperature of about 6,000 Kelvin, which corresponds to really a rather high energy photon, is the maximum of the emission. And this light gets sent out in all directions, but a tiny little fraction of it bathes the surface of our planet that is sitting in the way of those photons. And what happens is, when these photons hit the ground, they are converted into a large number of smaller energy photons. Okay? Because of energy conservation, for instance, you could make 300 Kelvin photons out of one 6,000 Kelvin photon. So you take this really, really hot photon, 6,000 degrees, like any metal we know would melt at that temperature, down to 300 Kelvin, which is basically room temperature or Earth surface temperature. Okay? So we're converting this one photon into a large number of photons, and this is an enormously entropy producing process. It doesn't waste energy. The amount of energy is the same after as before because of energy conservation, but it turns the energy into a different form that's less well controllable, because now you have these 20 photons flying all over the place instead of having that one photon. And so when people talk about conservation in the sort of ecological sense, they really should be thinking about not conserving energy or conserving water or things like this, because I can tell you, water does not disappear. When you put water down the drain, even in the most water poor desert or state or whatever, the water does not get disintegrated and end up in another universe. It's still there, but it might be dirty water that you can't use anymore. It might have diffused into sand so that you can't easily recover it. And so that's the actual problem. The problem is not that water disappears or that energy disappears and that we need to conserve these things. The problem is that entropy is increasing. And what that means is that it becomes more difficult to use the things that we have in a useful state, like the water in a cup versus the water dispersed into the sand, right? In a cup, like there's many possible uses for the water. When it's dispersed into the sand, it gets a lot more difficult because the entropy of the system is higher, okay? And so really when we're thinking about conservation, always keep in mind that, you know, energy is conserved and water is conserved and mass is conserved, and, you know, none of these things really disappear. What's not conserved is entropy, which is increasing. And what that basically means is that it becomes more difficult for us to use the energy and to use the mass. So life on Earth makes great use of this by producing these by taking this very high energy photon and turning it into many packets at smaller energy. And these smaller energy packets, which are now just on the order of a few hundred kelvins worth of energy, get stored in chemical bonds. Plants, for instance, use photosynthesis as an example, but there's other ways of storing the energy. But photosynthesis is a good example. They'll store the energy in sugars by having high energy carbon-oxygen bonds that can then be oxidized by the plant or by animals that eat the plant to actually release energy that can then be used to perform work in other processes, right? But this is done at the cost of taking this very precious low entropy photon and turning it into a bundle of lower energy but larger number of lower energy photons or lower energy packets, including the energy that gets stored during photosynthesis in the form of you know, plant material like cellulose or sugars or things of that sort. And of course, you know, 250 million years ago or thereabouts, in the Carboniferous era, there was a very high oxygen content in the atmosphere, a lot of CO2, a lot of plants. But due to climate cooling, a lot of these species died out, and a lot of these plants disappeared and just turned into fossils, which then eventually, through you know, spending eons underground in geological processes, got partly turned into things like shale or coal or oil or things of that sort. And so really, you know, what we're doing when we have a gasoline based industry nowadays, right, is we're just living off the plant life of the Carboniferous and we're just using it in a stored up format, and then, you know, we can release energy from it in various ways. Some ways are maybe not so clever, which is to just burn the stuff, and you can use the heat to drive engines to do things. And some of the ways are more clever, like let's say chemists trying to synthesize a cancer drug by using that oil is ultimately the raw material, actually, that a lot of these things come from. But one thing that I want to really hit home here, okay, is that very often the difference of something that we're currently doing, okay, that is maybe not the optimal way to do it from the point of view of conserving that entropy or making that entropy not like, you know, get to us, that actually the difference to alternative mechanisms that we think are so great is not necessarily always that high. Now, I mean, I'll use it here as an example. The idea of in the life cycle of gasoline, which is something that's refined from petroleum in the ground, right, or from shale oil or things of that sort, to corn ethanol, right, which in principle is something you grow every year. And you might argue, well, you know, if I burn that in a car, then, you know, I grew that corn and that CO2 can go back into plants again and grow more corn, and I can just kind of keep going through that cycle. Well, I mean, that's true if you're focused on energy and mass conservation, because yeah, you know, all the carbon is still there and it doesn't disappear anywhere, and the water is still there and so forth. But there is an entropy cost, of course, to these things. So when you actually talk about the energy that gets wasted into heat, pumping oil out of wells, the transportation itself, the refineries have to work, you know, all of these sorts of things. The vehicle ends up using up about, waste about 74% of the entropy cost in gasoline. Oops. But if I compare this to corn ethanol, well, it's true that the vehicle doesn't count so much anymore now, because the vehicle itself, it makes the CO2, but that CO2 came from a plant that was grown last year. And if a plant is grown again next year, then that same amount of CO2 will be used up. So you're just cycling the same CO2 back and forth. But there's still an entropy cost. There's still heat waste in agriculture and in transportation, and the biorefining that's necessary to turn the corn materials into actual ethanol that's cleaned up and suitable for putting into gasoline, the blending that needs to be done to mix it, and so forth down the line. And so actually in the end, it turns out that the entropic cost, which is actually the real cost of things, right, of doing corn ethanol, is 80% of the cost of gasoline. And once you realize this, you also realize that, you know, while it is very good to come up with alternative processes, I mean, this is already better, right? 80% is definitely better than 100%. The difference is not necessarily night of day. And I could have made this plot here with solar energy or wind energy. And trust me, there's lots of heat wastes and things going on in using those energy sources. Their entropy cost may be somewhat better, but it's not much better, okay? And so when you now look at this in terms of entropy, it turns out not only should you think about how to come up with new processes that make better use of the entropy, but also can we actually improve old processes, at least for the time being, because there's often economic forces at work, you know, social forces at work that make it very difficult to just shut something down instantly, right? It would be easy for me to say, right, I don't work in the petroleum industry, let's just get rid of it and make it all solar and wind power. I'm all in favor, right? But you know, if you're a petroleum industry worker who has been trained and worked in that for 20 years of their career, you might not be as happy about that idea and about that just from one day to the next, supposedly, you know, it should just disappear. So it's also worth thinking about how to take these existing processes and make them better. And I will actually tell you, so I mean, this is an example of one of my favorite scientists. So Hyo-kyung Timken, who works at Chevron, right, a chemical and oil company, I would actually argue, okay, and that she is the single most person in the world, in the entire earth, right, as far as having helped climate not completely go out of whack even earlier than it's already doing right now, even though she works for a petroleum company. And the reason is because the discoveries that she made, and she's completely unsung, she's an essentially unknown person, right? She's like a, you know, a research scientist at a large petroleum company, which are not like people's favorite, you know, companies or researchers necessarily to talk about. But her life's work was to take this process here and actually make it what it is today, which compared to 1970 is enormously more entropy efficient. This blue arrow here is bad enough as it is, but this blue arrow would be 1.5 times worse if it had not been for the discoveries she made in catalysis and in improving these processes to reduce all of these bad numbers for all of these items that are in that entropy chain, okay? And so actually, even though my kudos to all the people who research solar energy and who research wind energy and geothermal and all those kinds of things, the things that they have done over the last 50 years to improve our use of entropy are dwarfed by what this one woman did working at Chevron, basically, in terms of just how much less bad output of stuff we have or waste of energy due to, you know, an individual's contribution to research. So science has a big role to play in creating entropy efficient processes, because that's what it's all about. It's not about conserving energy. It's not about conserving mass or carbon dioxide or things like this. It's about you know, making the entropy go up less quickly. So we make less heat that is basically just waste. And you know, there's enough humans on Earth now that that's something we really do have to worry about. And life is really a good model for this. So you would probably not be too surprised, certainly not those among you who are biologists, to hear that one of the most efficient entropy creating processes on Earth is life forms, right? So we can actually, but also some of the most entropy efficient processes are actually processes that are performed by life forms. It turns out, for instance, the conversion efficiency for the photons to turn up in sugar energy, the losses while this photon is being converted down to lower and lower energies is only about 14%. So like 86% efficiency. That's actually really, really good compared to the kind of efficiency that we get out of, say, burning oil or things of that sort. So biosciences and biology are actually really good places to look at how you can run entropy efficient processes, because those are processes that are on near equilibrium and that really produce as little waste as possible. So for those of you who are taking like chemistry classes or physics classes, and they talk about these things like free energy and equilibrium and so forth, those are actually really, really important things, right? You know, pay attention when you hear those words in class, because really making near equilibrium processes and entropy efficient processes, that's how we need to think if we actually want to make things that are sustainable. Okay, so I'm going to stop here with my first slide and see if anybody has some questions they want to ask about this. Anybody? And basically, I'm happy to entertain questions, even about just this one slide for the next 20 minutes. If that's what you do, that's great. Yeah.
Well, let me ask a question to start things then. And it may be that I just missed answers to this, but do you have specific examples of sort of biological processes that you think are sort of ripe for industrial energy production?
Yes, so I'll give you one example only, because otherwise, yes, we can turn this into like 30 minutes. So one of my colleagues, Huimin Zhao, in chemical engineering, but also many other chemical and biomolecular engineers around the country and around the world, are very interested in processes that allow microbes to directly make highly valuable chemical materials by enzymatic catalysis in the microbe. So fermentation is the most ancient example, right? Turning things into alcohol, and alcohol can be used as a fuel for all kinds of things. Creating complicated or complex biomaterials directly in organisms through enzymatic reaction, rather than doing them in a lot of chemical steps in refineries, in the classical refineries, is one way, for instance, that we can make certain very high value chemicals, things that we really are interested in, medical compounds, things of that sort. Look at nature for making some of these things. Okay, so now I see actually there's another question appearing. How does nuclear power rate in entropy reduction? So nuclear power is actually very good. It's outstanding. And I will be completely honest with you. And I know there will be people who will probably disagree, but I'm actually a proponent of nuclear power. I think nuclear power, if it were carefully managed, could actually have been a real big help in, for instance, the climate crisis. It has severe problems that have to do with the disposal of radioactive materials. A lot of these problems, by the way, come because of human unreliability. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, people developed breeder reactors that can actually sort of make their own fuel and use fuel for much longer periods of time before it basically becomes waste. But the problem is that involves enrichment, and there's like the issue of weaponry and things like this, involved. And also in the construction of nuclear plants, like Chernobyl, a famous example, right? If you cut corners, eventually it's going to come to haunt you. And when you have something as powerful as nuclear energy, very, very high energy density, you really do need to stick to the specs and do what the engineers say and not mess around. So, if things have gone a little bit differently, and nuclear power had actually taken off in the 70s and 80s, that could be a significant contributor to our climate problems right now. Some countries have embraced it. There's a fairly serious nuclear industry in France, for instance, and others have not. Like my home country of Germany has actually turned out to go very anti-nuclear power and basically tried to eliminate it already decades ago, essentially completely. And in the US, is somewhere in between. It was more of an issue of benign neglect. And we have nuclear plants still operating here or there, but we're not building new ones, which is an interesting thing in itself, because nuclear power plant design has made enormous progress over the last 40 years. And there's a lot of passive reactor designs now that can't fail in the ways that, let's say, 3 Mile Island failed and things like that. And it would actually be interesting, I think, to re-examine things like this. So I would actually be quite happy if nuclear engineering and nuclear power departments at universities, of which there still exists some universities around the country, if there were a bit of a renaissance there, because I think that could actually be an important ingredient. And then there was another question. Can we pinpoint the evolutionary advantage for living things to be entropy efficient? So in a sense, if you're entropy efficient, that means you're making most of your energy resources. It means, for instance, that if you're getting an energy packet in terms of a sugar molecule, that when you digest that and you turn it eventually into carbon dioxide and H2O, that you're taking most of that exothermic energy that comes out of that reaction, and you're using it to power useful processes like muscle contraction, vision, all the other kinds of things that in different types of organisms, as opposed to generating waste heat. Now, of course, some heat that's generated is not even completely waste. So in the sense, for instance, that mammals, right, are thermoregulating organisms, unlike, let's say, certain reptiles that are non-thermoregulated. And so even the generation of waste heat for us is part of a process that is necessary for our survival, because we are homeothermic. But still, there's questions of how does an organism insulate each other? For instance, we always, fat is always like the bad guy in the room, like fat. We don't want it, right? But actually, if you were really, really low in fat, you would be in very, very deep trouble because fat actually plays many important storage and insulation processes in our body and makes us more energy efficient. And so it turns out in general, even though life forms certainly can also generate a lot of entropy going out into the environment, many of the main life processes, such as photosynthesis or certain types of metabolism, like say the fat burning metabolism, are actually operating relatively close to equilibrium. And what that basically means is there's this thing called free energy that people talk about in chemistry courses. If you're very far away from equilibrium, it turns out only a fairly small amount of that free energy gets used as it should be, for free, for the stuff that you want to do. And a lot of it goes into entropy and just turns into waste in the environment. And so a lot of processes in organisms, such as the ion pumps in our cell walls, or oxidative respiratory processes, or photosynthesis and so forth, have actually a pretty large fraction of that free energy getting used, and only a little bit, because the processes are still irreversible in reality, only a little bit of it getting wasted. So another way of putting it is that when you do things kind of gently and slowly, that's when you're able to be closest to being reversible. And that's when you're actually able to make the most use of your entropy or free energy. By the way, free energy, which is what a word that people like to use in chemistry courses, is just neg entropy. So actually another way of saying what neg entropy is, for those of you who have taken chemistry classes, is just to call it free energy. A very good name, by the way. There's another question: how do you consider batteries to factor into the entropy issue? Okay, so I'll give you one example, because your question again could have hours of answers. Batteries are really important, and the reason is because they provide us control that allows us to not waste things as entropy. So what is, for instance, one of the most difficult things with solar energy? Well, it's the fact that people want energy all the time, right? We don't just want it out when the sky is blue and it's like midday. We want it in the evening when it's night, and we want to watch our our computer screen. I almost said we want to watch our TV, but that's me, old guy. I'm thinking. Anyway, but the bottom line is. Batteries and any form of electrical storage is absolutely critical for many of these new forms of energy production that we're coming up with. Like solar energy, right, is now, well, in some ways, solar energy is, of course, thousands of years even old. I mean, even the ancient Greeks knew how to take a piece of glass, right, and then focus, it's curved and it can focus down and you can get something to start burning, right, and you can light a fire that way. That's like, it goes at least that far back. It probably goes back even much further than that. But certainly by the time we were in the mid 20th century, like 70 years ago, we knew how to use germanium, that it can absorb light and turn it into electricity and all this kind of stuff, or silicon and things of that sort. And we've made a lot of progress with these kinds of designs, and there's all kinds of perovskites and other materials. But the bottom line is, no matter how good you get these, those just collect the solar energy from you and turn it into electricity. Once you have it in an electrical form, you need to store it, right? And so actually having batteries that are as reversible as possible, and batteries that can be basically recharged and discharged without losing that capacity over time, are a really, really important thing to develop. And there's sort of two kinds of things that one can look at there. One is what's called fuel cells. So this is kind of the idea. It's actually a battery, but you actually can allow the chemicals to be continuously filled into the battery, as opposed to the battery being a closed, hermetically sealed thing. And so there's been a lot of development in fuel cells. The simplest one would actually just, you feed in hydrogen and oxygen, and instead of blowing them up, right, in an explosive reaction, you actually let them gently react at the membrane to make electricity. This, for instance, was used in Apollo 13, actually all the Apollo missions, as one of the main batteries on board, because they didn't have a big enough battery in the late 60s or early 70s to last for the whole flight to the moon and back. So they had a fuel cell, and on Apollo 13 that blew up. That's actually what blew up and caused all of this. You saw the movie, maybe Apollo 13, great flick, by the way. So fuel cells is one thing. Another one is just making batteries that can cycle over and over again. And there the big problem is that the electrodes of batteries have irregularities on their surface. They're not perfect. So there's like little dendritic spines and things that are sticking up. And these cause misreactions to happen where the ions don't exactly go where they should go and start eating up, surfaces of electrodes and things of that sort. And one of the consequences of that is eventually you can't charge the battery anymore. So you go through so many cycles and eventually that's it, you fall flat, so to speak. And then quick chargeability and dischargeability, because again, if we want to use solar energy more efficiently, for example, we need to have that ability to actually just charge up batteries during the day when we get lots of it, and then actually discharge them at night when there is actually consumer demand, for example, even though there's not a lot of sunlight around, or being able to feed them into the electrical grid. Like you all hear about brownouts and stuff like that all the time, right? That happen all the time. And part of the reason is our electrical grid can't just store energy. It's a very, very finely balanced engineering marvel, the electrical grid in any country, including the US, that can sort of hold inductively a certain amount of energy, but not just arbitrary amounts. And if you have, if you have lightning strikes or you get too much energy feeding into it in a certain spot at a certain time, you can get catastrophic failures. So again, there, we would make our energy networks much more robust if actually battery or fuel cell-like devices could basically just arbitrarily store and release that energy from the grid. And with carbon production, it wasn't as important because, if I have a factory that burns carbon, coal, literally, right, and I feed that into the electrical grid, I can just basically crank my carbon furnaces up or down depending on demand. I mean, literally, that's what happens, right? And you can sort of control the demand. But with solar energy, you're kind of stuck. I mean, the sun shines during the day and it doesn't shine at night. And so you do need to find ways to temporally redistribute that energy, and batteries are like really, really important part of that solution. There was one more question. So following this logic, we have moved from more entropy efficient uses of energy with early agricultural practices toward less efficient practices with fossil fuel driven industrial agriculture. Now it would be better for us if we moved back in the other direction. Is this correct? And is there a link to grow by local? Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. Now here's, in a sense, this is absolutely right? We should go more local. You just the entropy you save by not doing the transportation, right? I mean, most of the entropy waste actually from agricultural products coming to your supermarket is trucks driving it around, or trains, freight trains moving it around, right? Or in the worst case, if somebody's ordering like lobster by plane, from the west or east coast or whatever, it's flying, which is even worse than any of these other things. And so by doing things locally, you can do better. And we are able to do that now because, as humans, we have made a lot of progress communicating. So we can do a lot of our communication remotely. I mean, here by Zoom, even though I'm not in New York, although I wouldn't mind visiting, but still we managed to communicate this way. So there's a lot of communication has improved so dramatically over the last 200 years that we really should seriously think about, again, why not do things that we can locally? Because at some point it was nice to travel just to travel because, you got to see there was no way of seeing other people or meeting other cultures or whatever. But we do have other ways, and I'm not saying we shouldn't travel. I mean, travel is still an important thing, but we need to rethink it, and we need to rethink how much we can do locally and how much really needs to be done by transportation. And so that's a big issue. Now, there is one downside to it, though. It's somewhat easier for us to say this in highly industrialized nations, but it turns out, if it weren't for certain agricultural processes that do rely on industrial agriculture, like making ammonia and so forth, right? An even larger fraction of the world's population that basically starves and goes hungry right now would be starving and going hungry. We are still, because of transportation, not able to meet all of our needs of redistributing foods. And it's easier for highly sophisticated societies. And even though that sounds kind of contradictory, it's actually easier now in the context of the large human population that we have for us, like in the US, to live locally than for somebody that lives in a situation that's not as fortunate. Because, and the differences between now and, let's say, the Neolithic times is we have a lot more humans now, right? And so even though that worked, the purely local picture worked very well back then, it would actually be very hard to make it work with 8 billion people. Although it would be easier to make it work for those of us who are privileged and lucky. And so that you need to keep that in mind. So you don't want to throw out the baby entirely with the bathwater when you're thinking about the balance between how much can you do locally and how much do we still need to use global processes to make things for all humans work as best as possible. Okay, so I see there's no more open questions. So, and well, time flies. I'm like through, about 40 minutes of the talk. So, let me go and just do one more slide before I talk a little bit about my last slide. And let me pick one out. Yeah, I'll do this one. Why not? I'll just do the next one in line because I shuffle the slides randomly actually every time I give this talk. So if I only make it through two, I make it through different two each time that I do it. Let me talk about the fundamental applied pendulum a little bit in science. And this is just one of the many sort of more sociological aspects maybe of science, but I think it's a very interesting one. So currently in science, we are actually swinging through a swing of that pendulum where everything has to be applied. Okay? It's actually very different than when I grew up as a teenager, like in the late 70s or something like that, and I was interested in science and learning things in school, where actually it was much more towards the fundamental side. But it has swung back and forth, as in science, many times between the 16th century and the present. But currently, if you want to get a grant funded, it better be a perovskite containing solar cell global climate saving anti-cancer molecule or something. Preferably all of the above, at once, right? And then it's looking good for you to get funded. But on the other hand, if you said, I would like to study like the correlation between rotational constants of molecules because it's such a fascinating thing that people are like, So right now in this pendulum, we're kind of swimming, in the applied direction. So let me give you a few examples of this, though. And I think this is also true in other branches of human endeavor, not just in science, but I think science is a pretty good example. The element silicon, which all of our semiconductor industry is based on still, right? I mean, despite all the talk about carbon nanotubes, transistors, and whatever, everything that in our computers right now is still silicon, okay? That was discovered in 1825, okay? And yet it took well over 100 years before we had learned enough about it and its semiconducting properties and how to machine it and how to refine it and purify it and all that kind of stuff before we had a transistor, right? In 1940. So, and I can guarantee you the people who discovered silicon, or the person who discovered silicon, had no idea that you could make a device out of it that would be in like these handheld things that people use to talk to each other from one side of the earth to the other, 150 years in the future. It was completely inconceivable. The stretch from silicon to a microprocessor in a cell phone is too vast for anybody to follow. Another example, actually, since I'm talking about cell phones, right? General relativity is another good example. When this was invented by Einstein in 1915, and it was experimentally verified by Eddington and others in about 1918, there is no way that even somebody as smart as Einstein or Eddington, the theorist and the experimentalist, that they could have predicted that this would actually be built again into this little box and allow us to tell where we are within a few feet. And it turns out it's absolutely necessary. So these geosynchronous satellites that are sending GPS signals down to the Earth, the gravitational field of the Earth, right? Photons actually accelerate falling into it, meaning that they change their wavelength and their timing enough that you would not be able to predict distances good enough to do your jog and figure out where you ran when you downloaded on your computer your exercise app. Okay? For that, you need actually general relativity corrections in order to get it. Right. So, if you want only a few hundreds of meters, then you can forget about it. But if you want like sub-meter accuracy, and of course, our military can do like centimeters from outer space, kind of accuracy. They could actually map out the shape of that bottle sitting here right now through that window behind me. They probably are, but what the heck. Another example would be discovery of viruses, right? I think the first plant virus was discovered around 1890, but it took actually almost 100 years to get to a cervical cancer vaccine, for example, something where we actually could cure cancer that's actually virus based. And again, the people who worked on these plant viruses would never have had any idea that this could actually cure human cancer 100 years down the road. Or quantum rate theory, right, was developed in the 1930s. but actually took us until the 1970s to realize that this theory is the fundamental theory that actually explains the ozone hole and global warming. Most people here would not necessarily think that, but it's actually chemical reaction rate theories and radiative transfer theories that are basically these quantum rate theories that were developed in the 1930s that actually are the fundamental basis for understanding, making predictions about things like the ozone hole, which we kind of fixed up in time, right? This was a 70s to 90s problem, and we fixed it by getting rid of fluorocarbons, among other things. And we have an unfixed problem, of course, in our midst. But it's also based on exactly these same kinds of theories. So all of these predictions that people make, even if they're computer programs that don't explicitly use this quantum rate theory anymore, they're actually using it. They're using the rate coefficients and answers that came out of these kinds of models in the 1930s to actually do these sorts of calculations. So even if you're like a geochemist, a climate warming person, and you never took a quantum mechanics course, you are actually using it, even though you may not know. Just like when you're using the cell phone, you may not think about the fact that you're using general relativity theory. Or CRISPR, here it might be a little shorter, right? That was sort of developed about 25 years ago in its earliest stages and got a Nobel Prize finally, just a couple of years ago. It's possible that we could do genetic therapy by 2030 or so. Certainly it will become eventually possible. It might take a lot longer than that, though, for a variety of reasons, many of which, again, have to do with anthropological and social reasons rather than whether it's possible by the science or not, right? Because, there could be good genetic therapy and bad genetic therapy. And maybe you're going to throw out the good with the bad just to be on the safe side. Or maybe you're going to come up with laws or rules of behavior that actually allow us to use the things that could be advantageous while not abusing it. It's always interesting to see how it can be a long period of time between scientific discoveries that often seem pretty obscure. Like the virus seems like an obvious thing. It was a totally obscure thing in the late 19th century. And the same thing with relativity theory or whatever. It was physicists found it very interesting, but it seemed like a very obscure thing that has no connections to humans. And that's really kind of true for all of these different things when they first started up. CRISPR started out as a very arcane system by which certain bacteria defend themselves against others. And it wasn't clear at all there would be any human applications to people in 1995, 26 years ago. Okay, so I'll stop there with these examples, and I'll just wait and see if anybody has any questions or comments they want to ask about that topic. Applied science versus fundamental research, and how long it really takes before we know that something very basic that seems to be just knowledge for knowledge's sake, that's actually, it can change lives for the better or for the worse, depending on how it gets used.
And can I jump on the viruses and vaccines example and suggest that maybe there is an applications preceding theoretical understanding there, because things like smallpox vaccinations were beginning to be developed. People were starting to have kind of a sense of that you could prevent smallpox by vaccinating with cowpox. That was happening in like the late 18th century, wasn't it?
Yes, there was actually, that is correct. And so this is actually a very interesting question itself, which is how often does engineering get ahead of science?
Yeah, that kind of
exactly. And so actually from a phenomenological point of view, that actually does sometimes happen, right? The idea, for instance, that I think the example you gave there is actually a very good one, right? That, hey, if I inoculate somebody with some serum from someone else or something else, then actually this could give them immunity. And we don't know what causes this, right? We have never seen the little organisms or anything like that, but we can postulate there is something like that there. But I would actually say, even in these cases, so if you take that one as a good example, it took actually the development of technology in the 18th century to have syringes and to have steel. And again, there's actually scientific input that went into that, but there's also again some engineering input that went into that even before you went into the scientific input. And so in the end, I think it would actually make kind of an amusing discussion to argue whether like the first people who managed to smelt iron were they more scientists or were they more engineers? And I think the answer in the end is going to be both, right? Because probably smelting was discovered by accident initially, by having metals that smelted more easily, like copper alloys or whatever, in fires, and finding, hey, look at that weird rock that I threw in the fire, it actually made like a metal. That was the scientist at work, right? And that came first, maybe in that case. But then actually going after it and saying, let me throw another one in there and see what happens, and can I use certain rocks that work and other ones that don't? That was beginning the engineer, to be begin to think about it. So the two really always go hand in hand in developing things that humans develop. And sometimes the engineering aspects are actually ahead because we're kind of working phenomenologically with things without fully understanding them yet. And sometimes the science aspects are ahead. But even in the cases where the engineering aspects are ahead, there was always curiosity at the beginning of like, hey, I noticed something that seemed to help. Like this person got injured and they came into contact with this and somehow they didn't get sick. So maybe I should try that out and see if that works. But that was kind of the scientific observation, and then the engineering that followed up. But a very good point, right? They go hand in hand. And I use the word engineering here very broadly. Medical science, any of the kinds of applied sciences would fall within that also. I think we have a couple more questions. So let me see. Are you advocating that we need to return to a fundamental mindset in science, or are you saying that this pendulum swings naturally? I think it swings pretty naturally. We had basically, after World War II, it became very clear through the Manhattan effort that scientists can help win wars, for better or worse. And so the US government and other governments in other countries started pumping a lot of money into NIH and NSF and other kinds of science foundations. And it was so well funded that it was funded for the sake of science. It was actually, definitely, it was much easier to get a research grant even when I was a grad student in the 1980s. And it was even easier in the 60s, I think, from what I hear from colleagues that were my teachers back then, than it is now, when the success rates can be really, really small. And so there was just a very large amount of funding available and a smaller number of scientists. Now, more people have gotten interested in it, and there's actually a record number of scientists working in the US now. Funding has not kept up, right? And so I think part of the reason this pendulum swings is because it's easier to justify that you should get funding for something that will have a direct impact than something that could just turn out to be an interesting curiosity. But what I'm basically saying is that, while we shouldn't just do things for the sake of pure curiosity and idle intellectual interest, we should always keep these in mind, because even the word idle is a dangerous one to use when you combine it with intellectual interest, because as I said, very often these things that seem like idle discovery, people actually called the discovery of viruses an idle discovery in newspapers in the 19th century. These things actually can turn out to be not idle at all. They can save lives. They can change the way we think about the world, or the way that we do things, the way that we survive as humans, all of these kinds of things, the way we help the world be a better place, or sometimes make it a worse place, right? That can also happen. But they do have an impact. And so, and so I would say it's a natural swing back and forth. And I think we will find an era again where things are sort of going to be more satisfied just by curiosity. And so we'll see. That might take, like, if we can solve some of these problems that we're dealing with right now, which have a very strong applied nature to them, like somebody was mentioning batteries, so that solar energy can be distributed properly, all these kinds of things. We might get into a period again when we can afford to do this. I mean, after World War II, right? The period before that was a period of great strife. I mean, there were lots of wars all over the world in Europe. And I'm not saying there haven't been wars in plenty of places since World War II, of course, right? There's been a lot. But at least one small part of the world, sort of Europe and North America and some other places in the world, have actually lived through a fairly peaceful and pretty cushy period of time after World War II. And certainly it wasn't cushy during before, Great Depression, World War. And so we had a lot of time in the 60s and 70s to sort of think about science just as a fun thing to do. But now we face a lot of problems again, just because of the sheer volume number of people on the planet, like the ozone problem in the 80s, 90s, and now like the global warming problem and many others. And so that's why I think it's very natural for us to also think in more applied terms. Like, if we're putting money into science, it should give us something back that improves our lives, or even makes it able for us to live at all. Okay, so it's actually 4:55. So I'm gonna, as I promised probably would happen, I'm just gonna jump over all these other kinds of topics that I had and just pick out one topic out of these, 5 that are potential science breakthroughs, things that we haven't done yet, but things that we might be able to do. And I'm going to leave this slide up because maybe people want to discuss about this a little bit if there's time. And this time I'll just pick at random. Actually, I talked to Life on Exoplanets with the people from Tesla House. So I'm not going to do that because we talked about it before. I'll go to, and somebody mentioned nuclear reactions, and this is actually one element in that. But I'll talk about this last item here, wave function chemistry. And the reason is because it's potentially a way that we could really improve how we make chemicals, because everything in our lives around us, our food, everything is a chemical, really. I mean, it's kind of a swear word in some circles, but still, this contains water and carbon dioxide, right? That soda water, those are 2 chemicals, whether you like it or not. The way that we currently make chemicals is extremely wasteful of entropy, because what we do is, it's always kind of the same scheme. So I'll give you the sort of 10 seconds version of chemistry, right? We have a system that has 2 energy minima, like I'm drawing kind of like, think of the bottom of my hands here, like as the minima energy, and there's a barrier in between, an energy barrier that you have to get over. And the way we do chemistry is we have the thing that's on one side, and we want it to go to the other side. And the way we do this, we heat stuff up, and then we hope that's enough energy so it can get over the barrier, and then it comes back down on the side that we want. And of course, more often than not, it comes down not on the side we want, and we waste huge amounts of energy and all those kinds of things. Okay? But here's an interesting idea that comes out of the field of quantum information, which is something that's very hot right now in physics and in certain areas in physical chemistry. And this is the following idea. Quantum mechanically, we've all heard of Schrödinger's cat that's dead and alive at the same time. Well, quantum mechanics, it's actually possible for any chemical to be simultaneously on the product and on the reactant side, just like Schrödinger's cat. And in fact, that's much easier to do than Schrödinger's cat because molecules are much smaller and simpler to manipulate than our entire cats. And so the idea of wave function chemistry is actually that you use a phenomenon that's called quantum tunneling, so that you basically tunnel directly through this energy barrier to the other side without ever having to put in that wasteful heat and then come down again in the other well. So this is an example of something that's like very outlandish. We really don't know how to do it right now. There are people who are kind of thinking about what one might be able to do this kind of chemistry, but it would completely revolutionize the way we do any kind of organic, inorganic polymer, any sort of chemistry, because it would reduce an enormous fraction of the energy that gets wasted. I shouldn't say that, the entropy that gets wasted, or the energy that gets not used efficiently is the better way of putting it, by basically controlling chemistry, not at the heat level, but by controlling it at the wave function level. Okay, so now we are at the end of the hour, so I'm going to stop here. And if people have any questions about this slide, I'm more than happy to try and answer. Although again, most of the topics here, I am not a neurobiologist, right? So consciousness is not my specialty, but I'm more than happy to BS about it if anybody wants to. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully there'll be some more questions on that last slide.
Would you be willing to say a little bit about what you had in mind for alternative fusion?
Yes, sure. So let me get you started on that. And then please, everybody else, it's been very nice. People have actually been typing questions in, although it took them sometimes a couple of minutes. So I'll answer Doug's question, and then hopefully there'll be one or two more. So, so alternative fusion, okay. So currently, the major fusion project in the world is ITER, which is an international collaborative project that's housed in France, but the United States, Germany, France, China, lots of places, or Japan, lots of places are contributing to this. And the idea here is to make a plasma, which is a very, very hot mixture of gas at a temperature of literally millions of degrees, okay? And have this be a very dilute plasma where things are separated by hundreds of nanometers. That may seem like a very small distance, but compared to the size of a nucleus, that's actually a huge, gigantic distance. Okay? And then somehow what you're hoping is that in that plasma, these things that are actually not 100 nanometers, but that are like thousands of an angstrom, so they're like tens of thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times smaller, that these things will then hit each other and do it with a high enough energy that they can fuse and make a bigger nucleus. So like, let's say two deuterons could be fused to make a helium nucleus or something like that. And that releases an enormous amount of energy, right? That's how the sun works after all. I mean, our main fusion energy in the solar system. Okay, so one alternative proposal is, and again, it's pie in the sky right now, is actually this idea that why make something that's 20 million degrees, because again, that's extremely wasteful of energy, right? And why make it so that these things are 100,000 times further apart than their own size and they somehow have to encounter each other by sheer luck? What if we could make it so the stuff works at almost absolute zero, right? So we're not heating stuff at all. It's also much easier not to heat things to 20 million degrees. And we can position them already so they're like already a factor of 100 away from the size of a nucleus instead of a factor of 100,000 or a million, okay? And the idea is what you do is you take molecules, okay, and you shine a very powerful laser beam onto the molecule, but not to heat it. That's what they do at Los Alamos. That's again a heating method. You do it to eject all the electrons that bond the molecule together. And then you use the photons from the high intensity laser to actually bind the nuclei together. And this has actually been demonstrated, so one can actually do this. And then the natural vibration of the nuclei, molecules vibrate, back and forth, will actually cause the nuclei to collide together and actually create a fusion reaction. And there's actually a research group in England that has demonstrated how this could be made to work by replacing electrons in molecules by muons. So muons are an exotic elementary particle, but basically it has the same charge as an electron, -1, and it has a mass that's 200 times heavier than an electron. And that means, I'm not going to get into the technical details, that when you make a molecule with a muon as your binding particle, the molecule has a bond distance that's 200 times smaller. And so when you make molecules that have these super short bonds, because of the muon, they will actually undergo natural fusion because they're already close enough. There's a high probability they will fuse. And so you can actually have fusion that can be done at room temperature. You don't need to heat anything. Now, you wouldn't want to do it with muons, right? Because muons are expensive to make themselves. So it costs you more to make the particle than the energy you get out. But as I said, people have actually shown that in principle it should be possible to do this with photons. And photons are relatively cheap, like solar photons, for example. And so that would be one way of doing alternative fusion is basically do it at very low temperature and use photons, make use of the fact that molecules already have the nuclei pretty close together, unlike in a plasma where they're very far apart. And then you have a photon give the nuclei the final nudge that they need as they vibrate to actually make a fusion reaction happen. So this, in principle, could actually make fusion reactors that would be the size of your wristwatch because it doesn't have all of these requirements for shielded plasmas and high temperatures and things that you need. Okay, any other questions? I don't see anything else typed in. We'll give people another 30 seconds and then, it'll be until tomorrow, right? Because I'm actually signed up with a number of people to also talk tomorrow for my visit. Okay, Alice, I guess, yeah, people are exhausted. And let's face it, it is 4:03, so people have other places they need to go.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Gruebele, thank you so much. We're so grateful technology allowed you to join us in a safe way. I know simply as a teacher how difficult it is teaching into a black box. And so I'm so grateful for your energy and all your explanations this afternoon. I regret we can't thank you in person with our applause, with all the people that would come up to the desk and ask you a question at the lectern. So thank you so much.
I'll take care of it at my next New York visit.
So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and everyone enjoy this wonderful weather that we're having. Thank you again, Dr. Gruebele.
All right, thanks everyone for having me out, and I'll see some of you tomorrow. Take care.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.